I will never forget the first class that we had together.
It is truly like flying.
Where do you get all this energy from?
People who don't take risks end up, I do think, rutted in lives that may not satisfy them at the end of it.
What is the benefit for law students to also look at property and criminal law from a philosophical perspective?
You really miss the party.
You only applied to Harvard and Yale at the end of your senior year in undergrad and you got in?
On the other hand, I really want to go skiing. I hope you guys go out and do some crazy things.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Eddie Style channel, where we're doing everything Eddie Style. My name is Eddie Winner. Welcome to another episode of Interviewing the Law. Today, I have the honor of speaking with one of the most influential legal thinkers of our time. The founder and co-director of the Law and Philosophy program here at the University of Illinois College of Law, and my former criminal law professor. His work on criminal law, legal philosophy, and the moral foundations of punishment is basically required reading in every law school in the country. He graduated from Harvard Law and went on to build an outstanding career, shaping how generations of lawyers, judges, and scholars think about justice, punishment, and responsibility. Over the years, he authored 9 books and published more than 130 articles. He wrote about everything from legal topics to neuroscience to philosophy. He taught across top universities across the US, and he was a visiting professor around the world in places such as Australia, Singapore, Jerusalem, Berlin, and much more. Today, I'm very honored to welcome Professor Michael Moore. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Eddie. That was a nice and generous introduction. I appreciate it.
This was as concise as I could make it. Now, you may know that on the show we have a tradition. Every guest gets his favorite beverage, and you ordered a Diet Coke.
There we go. I know it's a boring selection, but it's too early for the scotch that I would have otherwise picked.
And I got myself some coffee for your long...
Thank you. I allow myself one of these a day at this age, so thank you.
Professor Moore, how are you today?
I'm good. Fridays are always good for teachers when you get done teaching. It's a very nice feeling.
Yeah, Friday is a very nice day.
Teaching is an adrenaline rush, and when the adrenaline seeps down, you're done for the week.
Well, as your former student, I can tell you that I will never forget the first class that we had together. And partially because it starts with one of the most shocking cases I've ever read. Crown versus Dudley and Stevens. It's a case about 4 men who got stuck on a boat in the middle of the ocean, 1,500 miles away from the nearest shore. They had nothing to eat. They had nothing to drink. They had no roof over their heads. And after 3 weeks, 2 of the men, the third didn't want to do that, but 2 of the men that had families decided to kill the young boy who was only 17, and he was drinking the ocean water and he was near death. They killed him. They ate his flesh and drank his blood for 5 days, and eventually they survived because a passing ship picked them up. They were brought back home. They were prosecuted for murder and sentenced to death. Professor Moore, what is the wisdom behind starting criminal law class with such a shocking case?
It's not the shock value that makes people select it. You want to ask that about every law class, and probably things that aren't law classes. Why are they starting where they're starting? Because the instructor clearly thinks it has some systematic import for the structure of the entire course. So in Dudley and Stevens, it's a sexy case in the non-sexual sense of that. Namely, it draws attention because of its dramatic facts and dramatic results. But it's in there to introduce everyone to the 2 modes of argument that dominate the criminal law. Namely, utilitarian modes of argument that concern themselves with deterring dangerous people from doing crimes, and retributive arguments that concern themselves with giving people their just deserts if they've done bad things, the way that property gives you just deserts if you've done good things. So there's 2 different modes of thinking that appear in the case. because clearly Dudley and Stevens saved lives by killing the cabin boy. The jury in its special findings found that they'd actually saved lives.
Right.
The question on a utilitarian ground was nonetheless whether that was in the long run going to lead to more loss of lives, because people would kill when they didn't have to in order to save what they thought would be their own lives. On the retributive grounds, it's a question of how much does temptation excuse you from doing things like killing an innocent boy when you're otherwise going to starve to death, for example. So it introduces both modes of reasoning, which is why it's there. Now, that's true about contracts or other areas. Why do they pick cases about the damage remedy in contracts? It's because it shows you what's distinctive about contract law.
Do you agree with the court in that case?
No, actually, and I don't think J.F. Stephan, who was the leading commentator of the criminal law of Britain in the late 19th century, he was very famous in his own time. Unfortunately, he had an even more famous niece, Virginia Woolf. He became known as the uncle of Virginia Woolf. But anyway, Stephan clearly did not agree either with the way the court decided that case, because in his digest of criminal law, he states the common law as not being what that case says.
Well, we can think about even a little bit cases that will get us to justify their behavior even more. For example, there's only one life vest and two people fighting over that life vest.
Sure.
One wins and the other one drowns. Is it murder?
Sure, and that one's as old as Cicero, because Cicero, it wasn't a vest. They didn't have vests. Two men come to the same plank that'll only support one after a shipwreck, and one pushes the other off. Cicero says to the Roman commanders, that's not a crime, because otherwise they both will die. Better one should live than both should die. That principle, after 2,000 years, is highly refined, so that when the Israeli intelligence services, for example, were engaged in a covert operation of applying the euphemism of pressure, most of us call it torture, to elicit information, the argument was the information is life-saving, so we're going to save people in the lifeboat if we use it, but the means that we're using to extract it seem to violate basic human rights. When do you get to balance those two things? And the Americans, of course, after 2001, we had the same debate. I participated in both of those debates and had a nuanced view, as it was called at the time. I was invited by the civil rights leaders, Kremnitzer and Gavison, to Israel, but ended up with a position I think the Mossad liked better than they did. But notice the issue is the same issue, which is, when do good consequences justify otherwise immoral actions? And that's fundamental to understanding the morality that underlies criminal law. And it's as present with us today as it was for the case you read.
It is a very thorny issue. If we talk about Israel, I remember that, well, I'm from Israel, and I remember that they implemented a policy after the Second Intifada, whereas they will destroy the houses of the terrorists because they said, well, they're not afraid of dying, but maybe if we'll destroy their homes, then that would deter them, which is obviously you destroy the homes of potentially innocent people that done nothing wrong. But the statistics showed that it had an effect, and it did deter terrorists from committing those acts. So is it just or not?
Well, that's a course in criminal law that you had to take to find out the answer, because it takes a semester to go through the nuances.
Yes.
That sometimes make that permissible and sometimes even make it obligatory to do what otherwise would be immoral, and sometimes make it immoral to do what seems to be immoral. So take this case for the KGB from the Middle East. So the KGB had 4 diplomats of the former Soviet Union that were kidnapped. One of them were killed by terrorists who were operating in Lebanon, but the KGB couldn't get to them. They knew who they were. So the KGB simply castrated the brother of one of the terrorists and sent word through channels that they would kill every member of the family of those 3. It's like the policy you're talking about, unless they released the Soviet diplomats, which the diplomats were indeed released. And I use that case to illustrate the difference between a utilitarian reasoning, which is they saved 3 lives of reasonably innocent Soviet diplomats, and no diplomats ever kidnapped from the Soviet Union again. On the other hand, they killed a guy who had nothing to do with it, totally innocent human being. in a grotesque way, the same as in your example. They bulldoze houses of people that are only parents of terrorists. They're not terrorists, right?
Right.
And when do you get to do that is an interesting question. I don't mean to be evasive. It's just there's too much to say to show you the nuances in differences. In my case, I think the KGB got that one wrong. In cases of both Israeli and American intelligence, I think they got it right sometimes.
Yeah, in class, we talked about the bombing of Dresden, where the British bombed the center of Dresden, Germany, in 1945 and killed tens of thousands of civilians. And obviously, we have the atomic bomb example as well. And till today, people debate whether that was justified or not.
So notice what those both actually illustrate, which is one of the things we did in criminal law class. The 2,000-year-old doctrine of double effect, been alive in the Catholic Church as long as there's been a church, which is the doctrine that says if good consequences are in the offing, then as long as you don't directly intend the immoral act as the means to those consequences, then you can do an act that will enable them as long as you don't directly intend it. So in the case of Dresden, compare that bombing to the earlier bombing by the American bombers targeting ball bearing factories, is where they started in World War II, to cripple the war machine. Those are legitimate targets. They knew, given the inaccuracy of the bombs, they would kill a lot of German civilians. But they didn't intend to kill them, not even as a means to ending the war. Dresden was different. That was a firebombing designed to kill the German civilians who were in the shelters because it sucked the oxygen out. It starved them to death of oxygen. It was designed to kill civilians. The aim was still to end the war, but the means was to kill innocents to actually dispirit the Germans enough to end the war.
I see.
That struck most of us as immoral. And notice some of the American pilots would not participate with the British.
Right, because it was a co-joint.
It was a joint operation, and they dropped their bombs in the field rather than the firebombing of Dresden. I actually gave the keynote address to the German Bar Association at Dresden the year that the British in Coventry put the steeple top back at the top of the cathedral in Dresden that had been destroyed.
No way.
It was a gift, 20,000 pounds for the gold cupola on the top of that cathedral by the first city in England bombed by the Germans, which was Coventry.
Really?
To the citizens of Dresden.
Wow.
And I gave as that speech this topic, which was so poorly received by the German Bar Association. I literally said at the end of the speech, "Are you still going to feed me lunch?" Because there was a very hostile reaction.
Why? What did you say that set them off so much?
It was using that bombing example to show some legitimacy for American practices of the time under the second Bush administration in torturing terrorist suspects to obtain life-saving information.
I see.
I contrasted that with the illegitimacy of the British bombing of Dresden. And one of those distinctions is that distinction between intentional versus knowing use of killing an innocent to achieve good consequences.
But if you were in Germany and you portrayed it as it wasn't justified, why were the Germans mad at you, or were the Brits?
Not for that example. Much more for thinking I was an apologist for the Bush administration, which I was.
Oh, I see. That's what they were thinking.
Because unlike the civil rights leaders in Israel who invited me into this mess a long time ago, I don't believe there's an absolute prohibition on torture. I think sometimes you not only permitted to use it, you're obligated to use it.
To save a lot of lives.
To save a lot of lives, or in certain other circumstances as well. In circumstances that you put initially, where the person who caused the problem is the only one who can alleviate the problem, but he won't do it. Then you want to say, look, someone's got to get hurt here. Who better than the person who made it necessary that someone get hurt here?
I see.
In which event, if you're sure you have the terrorist who planted the bomb, he's a good candidate for extensive interrogation methods to find out where it is.
Well, before we talk more about philosophy, maybe we could take a sip and really talk about your early life. You have a long and fabulous life, very colorful. You grew up in Eugene, Oregon.
God, you even pronounced it right. Most people who don't grow up in Oregon go Oregon or something like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's Oregon. You got it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Very satisfied.
There you go.
How was your childhood like?
All childhoods have quirks in them. maybe there are a few people who escape with no sort of challenges in those early days. I kind of think they might turn out to be boring people, but nonetheless, I certainly had my quirks. My parents got divorced when that wasn't usual. But when I was about 6 years old, and they did such a great job on each other, I ended up living with my grandparents because neither one of them could handle their kids at the moment. So that was an experience more traumatic, I think, for my sister than myself, but certainly colored the childhood experience. Nonetheless, I had two extraordinarily interesting parents. And I think that's also a great gift some of us get and some of us don't. As I tell many men when they have to do what you have to do in the normal course of a lifetime, which is bury your parents, when sons have to bury their mothers, I tell them what was true for me, which is that unqualified love that a mother has for a son gives you the true shield that Achilles held. You know, the old Greek legend has him being made immortal by being held in the river. It's not it. What he was shown by his mother was an avenue to be almost undefeatable in any serious sense. It's not that you're really immortal or invincible. It's this sense of confident self-esteem that good parents give you. That's fabulous. It's a gift that goes and keeps on giving throughout life. And certainly not the case all men get that from their mothers or that all people get that from their parents. It's a great gift. So I got that gift, which has meant, I'm sorry, I've kind of been a happy person pretty much my entire life.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. The mother's love, it's just something you can't explain, this unconditional love. What did you learn from your parents?
What did I learn from my parents? My dad always thought I got my analytic chops from my mother because he thought she was so damn smart. But he was no slouch. He just had a lot of grit. He was an infantry commander in World War II. He had his law degree before the war started, but he did not want to lead judge advocate court stuff. But when he was sitting in his boat headed for Utah Beach on D-Day, he said to himself, I could be running a town in Italy with all those other guys with law degrees because that's what the judge advocate corps could do. They ran these lovely towns. Not him. He was hid with Rifle Company Bravo headed to the beach on the 90th Division on Utah Beach. Anyway, he had a lot of grit. He was got the Silver Star for combated action, was Bradley's choice to lead the spear point of the Operation Cobra that broke the Germans in the hedgerows. Ultimately was overrun by a Waffen-SS Panzer Division and spent the rest of his life, the rest of the war in Poland, but survived.
Wow.
He had a lot of grit. I think he became a litigating lawyer because he couldn't find anything else in civilian life that was like combat. Namely, you go in and there's no sort of ambiguity about it. You either win or you lose.
That's true.
And if he had, as he used to say, if he had a week without a trial, it was a bad week.
Really?
It's what animated it was that kind of combat.
A week without a trial, that's a bad week. Wow.
He loved trial work. He did it his whole life, yeah. Anyway, grit from my father and probably both intellectual interest and appreciation of the I was going to say the finer things in life. I meant it in the crass material sense. The nicer things, good wines, fast cars, nice houses.
Yeah, your house.
She loved all that. She loved all that stuff.
When you were younger, you did a lot of skiing, and you competed actually in high school, and you won the state championship.
We did indeed.
Tell me about your skiing experience.
It's anybody who's grown up in the Pacific Northwest, at least if you're west of the Cascades, knows that you have 9 months of drizzling rain where it's cold and drizzly, but not cold enough to snow in the low valleys. It's really boring. So what my family decided was we needed something to do in the winter that made it not so boring, and it was skiing. So I started skiing when I was about 4 years old, and eventually then started racing. Our high school didn't have a high school ski team, so I and a friend of mine recruited pretty good skiers in the school to form the first team. And in the first year of our existence, we did win the state championship, which was 1961, the Dartmouth Cup. That cup still sits at the major ski area in Oregon, Mount Bachelor. I took my youngest set of twins up there when they were young to give them ski lessons. I got them each ski instructors because here's a truth everyone can use. You never give ski lessons to the people close to you. It's just not a good interaction. Even though you each love each other, let them get their own instructor. Anyway, I got them their own instructor, and my kids were so enamored of my background as a racer. They said, well, our dad's a world-class racer. So these instructors are laughing when they saw me. They said, so I hear you're a world-class racer. I said, well, there's that cup over there with my name on it.
Oh.
So yeah, we had a great time skiing. My high school ski team was a bunch of individuals that, of course, you form a close unit because you're only 8 kids in small cars running around the Northwest entering ski meets. Became an extremely important part of my life.
Skiing.
Yeah, skiing, but racing in particular. And I graduated high school thinking, it was a hard choice between continuing that and actually doing something serious educationally.
So regarding skiing, you wanted to have a career in skiing?
I had thought I was going to in high school, but then I made a choice at the end of high school. It was just not in that direction. I chose to go to the Naval Academy. My other choice was to go to MIT, but neither one was what a major skier does.
Okay, so at the end of high school, you're a state champion in ski, and you said that you got an acceptance letter from MIT and the Naval Academy?
Yeah, it's kind of a lesson of what not to do when you're trying to make major life decisions. So I took both letters and sat on top of a hill that overlooked my town, and I thought somehow I could make a list of the pros and cons of each decision. But that's not how decisions like that actually happen to you. They happen to you more than you get to make a list and decide.
How did they happen to you?
I don't know. It just became clear to me that I thought to go be a naval officer. We'd had a sailboat my entire life. I love sailing, love boats, love the ocean, love naval history. I thought, well, that's a natural thing to do. If I was going to go to MIT, I was going to be a mathematician, and I pictured myself doing math problems the rest of my life, and it sounded boring. As opposed to what was the picture? The Naval Academy picture was me on the bridge of a destroyer crossing heavy waves in the North Atlantic on the signal bridge with the water crashing around. That looked a lot better.
That sounds good.
Than teaching calculus to kids.
Yeah. Did your father influence you in going to the Naval Academy?
He did not, actually. He had the good sense to absolutely stay away, which is something else I learned. Just let your kids follow their nose. He had no influence. He was proud as a former Army infantry commander that I wanted ultimately to go. He always wished he'd gone to West Point, but never made a word of encouragement in that direction. He did come out and visit me when I was at the academy, but other than that was after the fact.
Do you find the fact that he didn't influence you to go to the Navy wise?
Sure. The problem for kids with successful parents is you try to emulate them, and there's no guarantee the kids have the skills that made those parents good at what they do. So yeah, you try not to influence kids to do what you like to do, or even worse, try to emulate them to do things you wanted to do but couldn't get to.
Okay, yeah, that's a thing.
You need to stay away. It's what I told each of my 4 kids when they went off to college and had questions about what to major in. I said, just follow what interests you. It'll probably lead to something interesting. But I certainly had no inclination even to try and influence those selections.
Wow, so young Michael Moore, MIT or the Navy. So which way did you go?
I went to the Navy.
Okay.
June 28, 1961, I reported to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, left my civilian clothes behind, my civilian haircut, and joined the plebes for plebe summer, as it was called, which was mostly a runaround. It was mostly, in those days, the entire first year, but particularly the plebe summer, was designed to harden you, as they said. And when asked for specifics, the official rationale was, well, the North Koreans have seriously interrogated officers and turned them into turncoats, basically, by interrogating them in harsh ways. So we want you to have gone through it before. So you end up with what I thought was, even at the time, sort of exaggerated fraternity boy pranks. So one of my favorites, gets really hot in Annapolis in the summer. You had to take a penny and put it on your nose and then press the penny to the wall, and you're sweating so that the sweat runs on down your nose onto the penny.
Okay.
You have to stay there long enough motionless that you stop sweating, the sweat that's there dries, and the penny sticks to the wall. If it falls, you have to start over again.
That's crazy.
Now, I actually think the North Koreans probably have more drastic things they're doing.
Yeah, slightly, yeah, perhaps.
Even at the time, I thought, this is just stupid, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, the plebe summer had a lot of things. I remember one guy wanted me to put my fingers in the socket. I said, I'm not doing that, and you can't order me to do that.
Wow.
Yeah, I thought that's pretty stupid too.
Were they trying to break you down and try to...
That was the official thought. You break you down, and then we build you up as a Navy man. I heard that phrase a lot. But look, everybody knows that's the game, at least at the time. I know the academies don't do that anymore, but that was the game. I enjoyed the part where, in those days at least, you could bet your ass, it was called. Namely, if some upperclassman and you disagreed on some point of naval etiquette or even Navy history, you could say, bet your ass, and he would have to say, bet yours.
Yeah.
And then whoever was right got to pick up the big paddle. The other had to bend over, and you took one in the rear as hard as he could hit.
Oh.
So one of my mementos from my academy days was having lost one of those bets, a broken paddle. He broke the damn thing.
No way.
Backhand. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Wow. You did not end up having a career as a Navy officer.
I did not.
What happened?
Late September 1961, the snow hit the Rockies for the first time. It was really early for snow in the Rockies. And I got notes from all of my former ski meets. They were starting to start training for the coming race season. It just hit me like a Gestalt switch in psychology. I was in the wrong place. But I really hadn't satisfied myself about what I could do in competitive ski racing. And I wanted to do that more than I wanted to be a Navy officer.
Yeah.
So it made it pretty straightforward. I turned in my resignation papers in a week. The academy sat on them for a month because they thought maybe I'd changed my mind. During that month, they wanted to show me what it was like being a seaman rather than an officer, so I actually scraped barnacles off of the bottoms of boats for a month.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Way to persuade.
Very persuasive. I couldn't wait to get out of there. Anyway, then transferred mid-semester to the University of Oregon, where is in my hometown of Eugene, which had a great, great ski team.
Interesting. How did you feel resigning from the Navy?
Yeah, in retrospect, you'd like to pretend like you'd made your decision and it was the right decision.
Yeah.
So what the heck? That's of course not how you feel.
Yeah.
You even have dreams about going back and proving that you could do it. Because of course, when you leave, I talked to both the commandant and the superintendent of the academy personally as I was leaving. They were dissuading me, saying, you quit this, you're just going to be a quitter the rest of your life. And what you're saying to everybody else is you can't cut the mustard when the going gets tough, can you? And you get a lot of sort of inputs, and you internalize some of that. You think, this is easier than sticking around and taking all this crap for another 9 months. That's true. On the other hand, I really want to go skiing. So the clarity of that second ambition blunted what you do feel, which is, of course, when you're only 18, this is the first big life decision you've made. Of course, you feel like a failure in certain dimensions, right?
Yeah, I totally understand. Well, then you went to University of Oregon.
Yes, I did.
Your undergraduate degrees, really impressive. You graduated in 3 years. You graduated with honors. You published a thesis paper called The Right to Counsel for Indigents in Oregon, published in 1965 in the Oregon Law Review. And you wrote it as an undergrad. You received recognition for high scholarship. You were the captain of the varsity ski team. You won a state championship again, and you were the president of the university ski club. Where do you get all this energy from?
It's really interesting. I've never understood it. I had a secretary at San Diego once who asked me your question, but she put it this way. She said, is something chasing you? I think I've always been afraid of getting bored. And the result is I just want to keep doing something that interests me, keep something out in front, like the rabbit in front of the dog, that's going around the track. Because otherwise, boredom comes too easily in this life. That's a retrospective construction. It's not how it feels. It just feels like the natural thing to do is to do a whole bunch of things. So on that list of things that you did, I remember my political science professor, my real mentor as an undergraduate, saying, "Mr. Moore, is the ski season over now so I can ask you a question in constitutional law?" I said, "No, not yet. I haven't read this stuff." Because in those days, our ski team took 4 nights away and only 3 nights on campus because we had to drive to the meets and get back. We would drive there on a Wednesday night and drive back on a Sunday night. So my
Wow.
intellectual commitments were minimal during ski season. But nonetheless, I was interested in what I did, so I did well scholarly-wise, as well as spent more than half my time on skis while I was at college. It did make everything extremely busy.
Yeah, I was an athlete in a D1 program myself, and so I completely get that. You returned to skiing, you were up in the mountain. Was there ever a thought, wow, I could have been on a boat right now in the middle of the ocean, and I'm on the mountain on this pure white snow, and I made the right decision?
Yeah, no, the right decision was always there. I never regretted not being out on the ocean. One of the things I still enjoy at this age is now I don't pick the same slopes I used to, but gliding at high speed on a slope where the slightest turn of your ankles, you can go anywhere you want on the slope. It is truly like flying.
Yeah.
That never leaves you. And I saw that at the time, getting a downhill right where you're scared to death because your average speed of those days was 60, 65 miles an hour. Your shoot speeds are often up to 80. That's really exciting.
That is very exciting.
That never leaves. I can run every downhill course I ever ran still in my head because you've got them absolutely memorized. It is so intense. When you come through that finish line, the world has completely disappeared. Your intention is absolutely telescoped on that race course. But when you come through the finish line, it's like the whole world returns to you beyond. It's a very intense feeling,
Wow.
which I never regretted subjecting myself to.
You wrote your thesis on the right to counsel of indigents in Oregon in undergrad. You studied political science. Did you know you wanted to go to law school at that time already?
I thought that's probably where I was going to go, not for very discreet or laudable reasons. I didn't have lofty ambitions for law as such. I just had an enormous good time as an undergraduate in those 3 years. And law school looked like the second avenue of a general education where you don't really have to commit to much of anything that you end up doing. And I wanted 3 more great years. I certainly didn't want to go to work with a bachelor's degree, and I didn't particularly at that point have an interest in an academic PhD. So law school was almost the default choice of how can I keep doing this great stuff, which is being a student, for 3 more years.
Yes.
And not have to really commit to what I'm going to do with myself in my life. So that was my law course, but it was a late choice. It was spring of my senior year of college. Actually, it was in May, my senior year. I was going to take a year off, a gap year.
Yes.
My best friend, who became my best man at my first wedding, and I were going to spend a year just wandering around Europe. And then he didn't get his degree because he didn't finish. And I didn't want to go by myself. I thought, maybe I should go to law school without the gap. So I applied in the spring, got in, and next fall I was in law school.
Interesting. So you applied that late and you still got into Harvard?
I did. I only applied to Harvard and Yale. I'm not among.
You only applied to Harvard and Yale at the end of your senior year in undergrad and you got in?
I did. But Harvard looked like a bigger pond, so I went to Harvard. There I was, the fall of 1964, suitcase in hand at another institution. Yeah.
On the other side of the country again.
Other side of the country.
How was that experience? How was Harvard in the 1960s?
Very competitive. That was quite interesting. I hadn't run into people like that.
Yeah?
University of Oregon wasn't like that. These were all type A overachievers. And the pressure of those first-year classes was enormous. Namely, you spoke because you wanted to participate, but you really didn't want to sound stupid. Because they were all 120-person classes. You really wanted to not sound bad. I did keep my skiing up so that I was skiing in Vermont on the weekends during the winter. Remember my first-year property instructor, he was our first class on Monday. I would come in late. It pissed him off so much he'd lock the door so I couldn't get in. So we had a tunnel at Harvard that goes underneath the classrooms. I would come in under the tunnel and then up the stairs and sit on the stairwell. He saw me one time sitting on the stairwell. He says, "Mr. Moore, you've been skiing this. Oh, no, come on up. Join the class." He was asking this long, involved question. And I was listening as I went all the way through this 120-person classroom to find my seat out in the middle. And he timed it perfectly so that as I just was sitting down, he got to the end of his hypothetical, which is, "So what do you think?" And as I hit the deck, he said, "Mr. Moore." Oh. And of course I had to say, "I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?" "For you, Mr. Moore, I'm happy to do so. I know that you ski, so I know this is really not your first love here. So I'll repeat the question for you. What do you think?"
Oh! Oh, wow.
Yeah, no, those are the old days. The old boot camps kind of law training. This was A. James Kasner, and I don't mind telling Kasner stories because he wanted to be a character. He wanted to be the kind of professor that if you look at those old film, 1L and what's that other one about that vintage, where it really looks like boot camp. So he would do things like the following, which I tried to mimic in my early years of teaching, but it's just not me. One of my classmates gave a perfectly good answer to one of his questions early in the hour. But the problem is what you want as a professor is to develop that answer so students see the alternatives, reject them, and then develop that as the answer. He got it right off the bat. Kasner would not let him have that. He said, "Oh, Mr. So-and-so." I asked that same question to Andrew III, who's my grandson. Andrew's 7, Mr. So. He's only 7. He gave an answer infinitely superior to yours. Well, you want to reconsider. The guy stammers and hammers and backs off. And then we do the hour discussion. He comes back at the end of the class to that answer as the right answer.
No way.
And he says, "So, Mr. So-and-so, they'll be such a wussy."
Wow.
So law school was like my first year, the old boot camp.
This is so interesting. In undergrad, I took a law class at ISU nearby, and one of my professors and mentors, Professor Jason Seasleek, he would ask a question, and you would answer, and then he would look at you kind of funny, and he would say, "Are you sure about that?" You would say, "Yeah." He's like, do you want to, would you bet your house on it? Do you want to change your answer? Do you want to rethink it? A lot of students changed their answers. And he said, "Why did you change it? It was perfect." And I really love this exercise. At Harvard, you were the team captain of the moot court.
We did. We won the moot court championship that year at Harvard. It's called, forgotten the name.
The Ames.
The Ames, that's right, the Ames competition. They have plaques on the Langdale Library. Our names are still up there. If you look at the Langdale reading room in the library, there are the winners of that. And we're up there with all the other classes.
So you are in this super extra competitive space. First of all, you are at Harvard, which is competitive in and of itself. But not only that, you are at law school in Harvard, which is super duper competitive. Not only that, you're on the moot court. You're the captain of the moot court.
Yeah.
Are you a competitive person?
You think? Yeah, I suppose so. I'd like to think it's internally motivated by a desire to do the job right, and not by sort of a desire to put anybody else down. Mm-hmm. But even in those days, we had a team of 8 writing those briefs. I got the final say as to what everything went into because that was the way it struck me the arguments would be the best they could be. I did have a guy who wasn't co-captain, but I remember one of my classmates was assigned to me because what I like are logically distinct arguments being made separately. What he liked, more a student of rhetoric than of philosophy, was the cascade of arguments where they're not separated, but they're persuasive by being a kind of unbroken cascade. They're not separated arguments, they're really distinct, but he doesn't make them distinct. The two of us would work together because I found his technique often quite persuasive. I'm much more of a teacher than an advocate. I like to get things separate. He was much more of an advocate.
You're very philosophical, which I personally really, really like.
Yeah, I view philosophy as actually not much more than careful thinking at an abstract level. I don't think of it as anything that's very specific in the way that, say, particle physics is. It's really mostly careful analytic thinking, which it shares with law. Lawyers, academic lawyers, and philosophers share an awful lot in method, clarity of thought. The common joke in both places is that most of the world is run like an English department faculty meeting, namely, is points that don't meet each other and discussions that are miasmic. But in philosophy and law, you actually want arguments to answer arguments and then advance in an orderly way the discussion. I think that's a benefit to both disciplines. It's a virtue of both disciplines. There is this unfortunate thing, the image that some people used to have, that philosophers about law are just lawyers who got tired of detail and put their feet up on their desk and pontificate about grand stuff. Philosophy is much more precise than that. I regard as the failure of my education, despite all your laudatory comments about Harvard, its failure was not to show you the philosophical groundings of legal doctrines.
Really?
The Harvard of the 60s was a relatively trade school, boring place in that regard. I took every law and course there was, law and psychiatry, Soviet law, anything except the standard law courses because they were so doctrinally oriented. And what convinced me to become an academic, because law is just a lot more interesting than I was taught. Namely, if you really probe, like where we started, the probe why it is Dudley and Stevens might or might not be justified, you open up an entire semester's worth of discussion of a deep, detailed, and not unprincipled sort about when it's the case the state can do something prima facie immoral for good enough consequences.
Yes.
That's just basic to running a state.
Yes, but also I feel like philosophy is the bedrock for law. I mean, what is law if not public policy?
But it's a great partnership, because what law brings is not only the same analytic rigor as philosophy, but it also brings the real life examples that put blood into the examples that are otherwise armchair examples of philosophers. We can do what Aristotle did in the Nicomachean Ethics now with greater detail, because we've got 2,000 years of cases. And it's not that his principles are any different than the ones that organize our criminal code, but nonetheless, we have all of those detailed cases where, as people say, fact just outruns the imagination of anybody. The cases that occur are stunningly, interestingly different.
I know. Just from being in your class, like the cases are just, whoa. I remember sometimes leaving your class and just being, when you're like in meditation or like you're in a deep conversation, or you're at a movie theater and you're really into it and then they turn on the lights, but you still kind of need a second. That's how I felt because of the cases, because of the philosophy you brought. So if you could design a law school curriculum, would you put philosophy into it? And if so, what type of philosophy?
Yeah, I've been having that thought experiment for a very long time. So, we had a proposal, my wife and I and a third person, when the University of California system announced the university system that's run by the Board of Regents, they were going to have a new law school. We took that to be a great opportunity to do something I wanted to do all my life, which is have what I call Plato's Law School, where all of the courses are developed in the theoretical way that would have made my orientation so much more interesting. But property, contracts, torts, those are just as interesting as criminal law in terms of their presuppositions.
Yes.
And constitutional law for sure. So we put together a proposal which would have made every course a theoretical course taught mostly by PhD philosophers and JD lawyers. I spent a lot of my career doing things like that. I ran the Law and Humanities program at Harvard in some years after graduation, which was a program designed to train 12 law professors a year in how the humanities, philosophy included, could enrich legal teaching and legal scholarship. I then ran the jurisprudence component of the jurisprudence social policy program at Berkeley for years, with the same desire, although it was a little bit broader, because we included the social sciences. So to get a PhD in our program at Berkeley, you did not only philosophy, but you also did economics, political theory, a bit of anthropology, sociology, along with a law degree to end up with a JD PhD in jurisprudence and social policy. So I've been doing that sort of interdisciplinary educational stuff for a very long time.
Beside the fact that it's more interesting, what is the benefit for law students to also look at property and criminal law from a philosophical perspective?
Because it actually penetrates the practice. The beauty of theory is not that it's this pie in the sky thing that people who just have to think abstractly do by themselves. If done well, it penetrates how you practice the law of which it's theory. So if you figure out that, for example, you think the Lockean theory of property is persuasive, namely that people who labor and create something new are entitled to the fruits of their own labor. And if you're like Kafka, you want to destroy what you wrote, it's yours to destroy. No one else has any say about it. Well, even though it would make everyone else worse off, it's not their say because you're the one who created it. Suppose you find that persuasive. That will impact how you frame your copyright laws protecting intellectual property, for example, because you won't frame them necessarily from the incentive perspective, what incentivizes the production of these things. You'll rather frame it from the who deserves as a matter of fairness, because they're the ones who really worked on it.
I see.
The protections of a property right.
I see.
So we had a course we required all first-year students at the University of Southern California to take, first-year law students, called Law, Language, and Ethics, which was to introduce them in a general way to the power of philosophy to enrich all of the rest of their classes. It was a hard class to teach because if you're teaching property or torts or criminal law or constitutional law, first-year students who don't know anything about the law immediately recognize you as having authority over their professional lives because you're teaching something they know to be at the core of what it is to be a lawyer.
Yes.
People teaching law, language, and ethics did not have that benefit. You look like academic frou-frou that is put in front of them that they have to do to get to the real law stuff, which those other courses say. You can overcome it. It was a tough course to teach. We burned out a number of my co-teachers teaching that course. Some years I would take the whole class. I would keep the whole sections of it. The benefit I saw later in life was this. We surveyed graduates 5 years out from law school as to the class that in law school that most influenced their practice. I was astounded to see that in some of those surveys, my law, language, and ethics class was rated first.
Okay.
They saw the point. They got it at the end of the class, not necessarily at the beginning.
Now, you started teaching at Berkeley, correct?
As a legal writing instructor, late 60s, 1969, and then a remarkable time. My students now laugh because I keep telling them Berkeley stories.
So you taught at Berkeley in the late 60s, early 70s, the hippie era. How was it like?
I told my students in class just last week, I said, look, I know you guys looking at this old guy in front of you want to know sort of what the 60s were like at Berkeley. I said, what you believe is true. You really missed the party. Wow. It was different. So here's an example that I've never seen or even heard of anywhere else. I was in charge of the moot court program that year, 69-70. We had our first moot court presentation. It was in Noel's moot court room in the Bulk Hall auditorium, which has a very high elevator. It's supposed to mimic something like the Supreme Court. Sitting up high is where you are. Anyway, the students, the guys, all show up stripped to the waist, dressed in war paint with feathers because they're supposed to be the Costanoyan Indians. So were the Indians who occupied the land before the white man came, right? And they offer to the moot court judges, including myself, I was judging a case, come down and join the people. This is an authoritarian structure, and the Costanoians would not have put up with it. So get off that bench and get down there. We would not. So they were armed for that. They were ready. And they had these big boxes, and they pulled out, oh, God, what are they going to throw at us? Big, soft, white marshmallows. I said, this is getting to be a very strange way to make a living.
Wow. Yeah, no, you have, throughout the semester, you shared a lot of really fascinating stories about your time at Berkeley, and it kind of made me wonder, are we missing something today by being very, very, as I see it, down to earth and relaxed? Because we are very professional, and even in private settings, it's kind of feels the same. Like there's no it's still very professional. Everything, nobody does anything crazy. When we go to the bars, they'll like drink their half beers. Nobody gets too intoxicated. Nobody has crazy ideas. And after hearing you, I'm like, are we missing something? Because we are in our 20s.
Mm. I actually sometimes wonder that. I was sitting with a very good friend of mine, just retired from NYU. He's a legal philosopher too, but he does environmental law. He and I were hiking. We did a conference in the Sierras. We were backpacking out, and we were wondering whether the generations that succeeded us missed something. Because we had a looseness about our careers. We were both serious students. We both did really well. He got his PhD in philosophy at North Carolina, one of the leading philosophers in the world in environmental ethics. We both were quite serious academically and intellectually, and yet we seemed to be free from the prison of a driving ambition that many graduate students, including professional law students, suffer from. In my case, for example, a lot of my classmates were headed off to Wall Street to practice law. I remember sitting in the subway in New York with one of them headed into Wall Street. I and my first wife had backpacks on. We were headed to the airport to fly to the islands of Greece. We were going to live out there as long as we could, which turned out to be quite a bit on $3 a day. You could live a long.
Oh, wow. Sounds lovely.
That's where we went. And the same for him. He took off. He said, I didn't even know North Carolina was a high prestige philosophy department when I went there. So we had a kind of freedom from an insecurity and not even an insecurity, an uncertainty as to whether you're going to get in this life what you want. Somehow we felt assured we would without having to worry about it. That's interesting. That's a heck of a gift. Because if I watch other kids worried to death about what's going to happen next, God, we just maybe we were stupid. We just didn't worry that much. Whereas I think successive generations have had more ambition. It also makes a difference what the market is like. When I entered law practice in 1968 in the winter, having run out of money on my Greek island, you could bill 170 hours in a month and it would be acceptable. You'd be fired in 3 months at a major Wall Street law firm that was at that billing rate, which meant you could have a more balanced life. It was more relaxed too. The professional demands were more relaxed. This is a tougher world, I think.
You think?
I think for law practice it is. For law teaching, it's a lot more serious stuff. I don't know anybody who did the stuff that we did that comes up today and says, oh yeah, I kissed off all academic and professional opportunities and lived out in the Greek island for a while till I ran out of money. Then I hitchhiked a ride into the American embassy in Athens and wrote a letter to the law firm saying, I'm ready, can you fly me over?
I love it.
Nobody does that stuff.
It's interesting because I thought it's the reverse. I thought that today with all the work-life balance thing, all the mental illnesses, all the breaks that we push to get, I thought today we have it quite easier.
Well, you might have it easier, but maybe you make it harder on yourselves by that kind of an ambition. But look, I hope that the people I'm teaching today are like the students that were with me, now 60 years ago. I hope you guys go out and do some crazy things.
And it doesn't mean that one has to be like not responsible or doing things that are unethical, but somewhere I do feel like we're missing something, some adventure, some spirit.
You also have to have a willingness to take some risks because you can't just always play it safe and have a life at the end of it that you look back and say that was a great ride.
Right.
You got to take some chances. Because nobody gets everything handed to you. So you take some chances. I know a number of academics who've been offered interesting things to do. And look, teaching class is great, but it's every year you can teach in a class. And there are other great things to do. And don't do it because they don't think they'd be rehired by their same institution. But they'd be rehired somewhere, and they might be right about that. Take the chance.
Right.
Take a risk. People who don't take risks end up, I do think, rutted in lives that may not satisfy them at the end of it.
Professor Moore, you taught many classes, you taught at different places. What are some of the most memorable experiences you've had?
Well, that's a tough one because the kaleidoscope of, what is it now, 55? 56 years of teaching, that's a long time.
Right.
it's always early. It's always fun early on because it is uncertain, despite not being anxious about the uncertainty as I described a moment ago. It is uncertain what you're going to do. It's remarkable to me at this age with my fellow octogenarians how much more your lives look like they make sense in retrospect than they ever felt like they made sense in prospect. Because when you're looking at a branch of different opportunities, they all look like they lead in a myriad of different directions. You really don't know exactly what you want to do. That's always a kind of confusing thing.
Yes.
But somehow you make your choices, and as you look back at it, somehow they look like they all made sense.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah, they all seem to look like they led somewhere. So out of that rich kaleidoscope, I don't have a particular, I'm very pleased to have had 55 years of thoroughly enjoyable teaching at 10 or 12 different universities and quite a few different courses in now 3 or 4 different disciplines.
Yes.
I think the one common thread is actually curiosity. It's nice that the society makes a virtue out of it. It's a totally selfish thing. Namely, satisfying your own curiosity is just for your own benefit. But fortunately, it has some social side effects that seem to be good. We actually do advance knowledge and make systematic contributions to law, for example. But that has been the common thread, and it's never left me. I still enjoy things most when I'm figuring something out I didn't know.
I would like to respectfully disagree that curiosity is selfish, because I find curious people to be more useful and more valuable than non-curious people, because they just have more, colorful strips on them. They just know more about different things. So you can find yourself in different situations with them, and they will know something useful or may know something useful.
We could actually not be disagreeing, because you could be saying there's great utility in that curiosity, and I could be saying, yeah, but the utility isn't what motivates me. I know that it does, and it's nice that it does.
Yes.
It's a known side effect, to go back to our bombing description, not an actual intended means. But it is nice because you're right. If you're curious about all sorts of things, you learn an awful lot of things. And then if you keep your ears to the ground, if you're lucky, a number of opportunities come your way of quite divergent sorts. So I've been very pleased as a legal academic to have a law practice I never could have had I stayed in a law firm. With governments particularly being interested in different things, the different questions that I get to pursue. So just a few examples. I was in Norway for a number of years after the Breivik verdict in 2015. The person who killed 69 teenagers on that island, plus a number of people in downtown Oslo, advising the Norwegian Parliamentary Commission on how to revise the laws of insanity to deal with cases like Breivik. I found that to be quite interesting. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, my wife and I and a few other law professors were the guests of the German and American governments in re-educating former communists. That was a great gig. They gave us a castle south of Budapest on the Danube, an unlimited alcohol budget, because the Eastern Europeans, under communism, all you ever could do was drink. So they could drink us under the table, but we had more liquor than they could drink. Anyway, we would re-indoctrinate. I always started those sessions out every year with, I am here and my colleagues are here to make you running dogs of capitalism, Chairman Mao's derogatory term. And we did. We got to teach them democratic systems, protection of human rights, and capitalist economies, and what you need to have as a legal system to achieve those 3 things. And that was fun, because you take something like property, which is what I taught, everything that you know, condense it into 6 1.5-hour lectures that someone who's deciding in a new legal system whether they want a legal area of law like that, what should they know to make an intelligent decision?
Wow.
That's fun.
That's a task.
That's fun. That was good stuff. The Israelis and the Americans both approached me, both the intelligence communities, with regard to the torture issue. It was an odd thing, but it was because Joseph Raz at Oxford and I were teaching a worldwide seminar on the nature of ethical obligation, and they heard about it, and they thus approached us back in the late 80s as to whether we could comment first on the Israeli thing, and then after 2001 on the American thing. the CIA actually read our Israeli report and then asked me to comment about American practices, which itself became like a little bit of a spy novel if you read those. Who's that guy who writes the great ones? Former CIA agent. Anyway, I had first been asked to come and give a lecture to the Joint Task on Terrorism at Langley, the headquarters of the CIA, which was then running the Joint Task Force. And I had turned it down because I thought, I'm going to have to sign a secrecy agreement and I don't want to bind my academic thoughts in this way. But my colleagues out in California said, look, you got to go. They want to know something that you know, academic, they've thought about because you do ethics. They really want to know what you guys have been discussing in that seminar. So, you're obligated to go. So I changed my mind and said I'd go. December 7, 2001, I was supposed to be at Langley. Got a call from the director telling me, don't show up because the Senate Judiciary Committee's gotten wind of your coming. And they're waiting for you with subpoenas. They won't hit you on the way in. They're going to hit you on the way out. So you'll have to divulge because you don't have executive privilege, what we're talking about in here. So don't come.
Really?
So they gave me a Dropbox in Maryland where I could send materials to the CIA about the torture practices of the world and what I thought about.
Wow.
But look, those are interesting kinds of practice. Right?
No, you have to come back on the show because as part of my preparation, it was so hard to decide what to talk with you about because I feel like we can talk about just that for an hour or two.
Well, here's one more for your future topics. After the Twin Towers went down, of course, there was a lot of intelligence work that was done, but the private litigation was a wonderful insurance question. The Rubinstein Group, which held the lease for the World Trade Center for the Twin Towers, had knowingly insured the towers for only half of their reconstruction value. Because if you remember the history, in 1993, the terrorists had put a truck bomb in one of the towers. Their idiotic plan was by putting it on one side of the basement, they were going to knock one tower into the other and knock both of them over. Every engineer said that was not going to happen. So when the Rubinstein Group got together, they took over the towers just before 2001. They said, we don't need to insure the full value for $7.2 billion. We'll insure it for $3.6 billion per occurrence, which is how casualty policies are written. Your limits are $3.6 billion per separate occurrence.
Okay.
And then you get two jetliners taking out two towers. Is it one occurrence or two? 3.6 billion or 7.2 billion, right? So it's a $3.6 billion question of how many events took place when the Twin Towers went down.
Okay.
$3.6 billion draws a lot of bees to the garden, namely lawyers. So I allied myself with the Wachtell Lipton firm in New York, representing the Rubinstein Group, where we were arguing for two. It's $7.2 billion rather than a one single payoff.
Interesting.
And why did they ask me? Because I had written about double jeopardy in criminal law in my Act and Crime book. And that's the one place in the law where you literally have to count how many times somebody has done something, right? So if you rob a bank on Monday and then rob the same bank on Tuesday, that's two crimes.
Yeah.
If you shoot one guy with one bullet, but the bullet goes through him and kills somebody else, that's two crimes. You need some sense of how you count crimes. And counting events for insurance policies is not that different. So, wonderful case.
They ended up with a single event at the end, right?
We had a split trial because it was the largest casualty policy ever written in North America for those towers. So it was reinsured. The insurance company that wrote the policy reinsured it, and the reinsurance company split off. So there were two trials. The jury came in, it was two in one of the trials and one in one of the other trials. They split the difference.
Okay. Interesting. Wow. Okay. Before we talk a little bit about your scholarship in more depth, I wanted to tell you about one of my most memorable moments in law school.
Yeah.
Because that was at your house. You and your wife have a lovely tradition to invite your students to a gathering at your lovely home and do a talent show. And I performed with my guitar and I sang Hey There Delilah.
Hey there, Delilah, I know times are getting hard, but just believe me, girl, someday I pay the bills with Professor Moore's salary.
And I would like to thank you because I feel like I satisfied one of my dreams. I didn't know that that was a dream of mine, but going back home and watching the video, I was just so happy for so long that I got to do that in front of all of you. So thank you. When did that tradition start, by the way?
Well, it's not that specific a tradition, but having students to your house, I remember as a student going to my professors' houses,
Yeah.
and I thought that was very special. You get an insight into a world that you really don't know how it operates because all you see is the show that the professor has in class. I thought that was extremely interesting. So we tried every year to have some kind of an event like that. I remember your performance quite well. And what you see when you see the video of it is what we saw when you did it, which is this enormous warmthing of the audience. It's like you're binding that group together. That was a great group experience as they started to group sing with you.
Right.
I thought that works perfectly.
Oh, it's what you do to me. Oh, it's what you do to me.
Yeah, we've always had student events because when Heidi and I first got married 38 years ago, she was still a student at the time. And so we started that tradition with her classmates, namely, since it was, in those days, not at all a problem for professors to marry students. We had 7 professors marry students within that year.
Really?
Yeah, we had to
Oh, wow.
go to law school, find a professor, and it was both ways. Mostly male professors marry female students, but the other way as well.
Yeah.
Male students marrying female professors too. So both ways. But anyway, we just decided, since there was so much curiosity about this student-professor romance, we invited her class out for our first party. It was we had a place on the beach at Malibu. We had the entire class out to Malibu for a big beach dance.
Really?
Yeah. I saw how unified that was. I mean, those classmates of hers, we still hear from pretty regularly.
Ties back to what we talked before about the looseness of your generation. You seem to be a little bit looser, and as a side effect, I feel like wit comes with it, because I feel like your generation is way more witty than our generation.
Well, that may be partly a function of age too, though, because one of the beauties of age is that you mellow, so that you don't have to take yourself so seriously anymore. That allows you to be considerably more looser in retrospect than we probably were at Crosspark when we were younger. Yeah. I think that may be a function of age. It is one of the graces of aging in this profession or any other. It's not nearly as bad as you think when you're looking at a person at what it must be like to be old.
That's a fear of
At
mine.
least until the health goes. It's great.
Yeah.
It's just great. Gets better and better.
So, Professor Moore, I got to read your Mechanical Choices, The Responsibility of the Human Machine. You mentioned Robert Sapolsky, who's a neuroscientist at Stanford. He thinks that we should abolish our views that punishment is deserved, because he thinks that with today's neuroscience, we can see that some people don't really have that much control over their actions. You disagree with him. Why?
Well, mostly because he's wrong, but also because he gets in my way, but mostly because he's wrong. Anyway, like Bob and I have a long history, so we got quite a bit of money in 2 different grants from the MacArthur Foundation, about $15 million, to study the relationship between neuroscience and criminal responsibility. We actually owed Bob a thank you for that money, because his proposal as a former MacArthur Foundation Genius Award winner to the board at MacArthur had been, you ought to get a bunch of neuroscientists and criminal law theorists together, and they could do what I think they should do, which is abolish the criminal justice desert-based system and institute a kind of medical model with regard to how we handle criminals. And the board bought it and gave us all this money. The problem is none of us believe what Bob believes, and thus we didn't do anything like what the board anticipated. Namely, we did a lot of experiments, but what we were interested in was how neuroscience could actually help you determine particular issues of responsibility, like that of addicts, because we know an awful lot about the neuroscience of addiction, like that of psychopathy, because there's an awful lot of psychopaths that are criminals and the like. What Bob wanted us to do was, join the campaign to get rid of the criminal justice system. So he showed up at one of our earlier lectures, and we basically took him to pieces on this thesis. So what's wrong with his thesis? Neuroscience is just the newest kid on the block of all the deterministic scientific systems explaining human behavior. Before Bob Sapolsky and his version of neuroscience, there was Fred Skinner. He used to come to my seminars at Harvard with his behaviorism, thinking that stimulus causes show you that no one's got control. There are the geneticists who want to say the same about the genetic basis of responsibility. Before both of them, there was Freud with his psychic determinism in the unconscious. This has been around ever since Hobbes. The idea that there are material causes for human choice that somehow rob choice of its causal efficacy is just a fundamental mistake that's been around for a long time. But it is a mistake, and those of us who do philosophy have known since David Hume the kind of mistake it is. It mistakes the idea that to make a choice that makes you free enough to be responsible, it has to not have any causes to it. Who's that? That's God.
Right.
There are no gods. We're not God. So if that's what we have to have, we don't have it.
I see.
It's real simple. But we don't have to have it. What we have to have is what Hume said you have to have. You have to have the capacity to cause by your choice the object of that choice. That's how you have control over what happens in the world. So suppose you're my big enemy, and I say, I really want to kill you, so I form the intention to kill you. I therefore put a gun to your head and pull the trigger and kill you. It has to be the case for me to be responsible for your death that I controlled how and when and that you died. Oh, didn't I? In any ordinary sense. Now, it's true the antecedents of my choice at some point in my background, in genetics and in environment, were not chosen by me. We are all part of the sea of causation that we do not originate. God and the Big Bang are the only prima causes there are. None of us are that. So if we have to have that for responsibility, we're all done. Didn't take neuroscience to show us that. Showed us that with materialism of his sort. But we don't need that. At least there's no showing that you need to have that kind of free food. So if you look at the things that are excuses, when we do actually excuse people, it's not because they were caused by something else. It's rather because they were incapacitated.
They don't deserve the punishment.
Well, they don't deserve it, but more specifically, they really couldn't have fairly been asked to do better. So take Dudley and Stevens. They're sitting there starving to death in that lifeboat. Even if the right thing, and that's debatable, but suppose if the right thing was not to eat Richard Parker, the cabin boy, if that's what they should have done, look how hard it would have been for them not to have eaten that kid. They're starving to death. Every day they see someone who's going to die anyway that they could prolong their life with. The temptation would be enormous. And you might then say to yourself, they had less ability to not be killers than the rest of us. You and I don't have to kill anybody. But we're not starving in a lifeboat. Their circumstances gave them a plausible excuse. But the rest of us don't have that. The rest of us have causes for our behavior just as much as Dudley and Stevens did. But we do not have the constrained choices that constitute the excuse of duress or of natural necessity. So we don't have a thing that would erode control. We have control. If I put a gun at someone's head and pull the trigger, although I can't rule out all the causal factors that might intervene, I don't have control of the causal factors that made me make the choice that I did, but I still did choose to make the world worse, and I did. I made it worse in just the way that I intended.
That's fascinating. I wish we had 8 hours, but because we don't have 8 hours, are you ready for our rapid round?
How does that work? Am I supposed
Ding,
to
ding, 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 ding. So these are just unrelated questions to each other.
Okay.
Because I can't ask you unrelated questions when we just talk about A. I can ask you about C because it's not coherent. But here,
I can do that.
Very good.
So I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions and let me see what you think about them. Question number 1, if you could instantly master a musical instrument, what would it be?
Piano.
Why?
Mostly listening to my younger daughter, who's a beautiful pianist. If I could do that in the afternoon, I probably wouldn't be here. That would be great.
Yeah, you have a lovely piano at your house.
I actually have 3 of them, but yeah.
Oh, I didn't find the other 2. The house is too big. Who is your favorite philosopher?
My favorite philosopher. Hume's pretty close. He got so many things right.
I thought you'd say Kant.
No, Kant's too stuffy.
Hmm.
He's interesting because often he's wrong in interesting ways. He's very fruitful in that way.
I'm sad that you didn't say Kant because I thought you'd say Kant and I learned a lot about it to sound smart. But
He's a runner-up. So go ahead.
Great. Which actor would play you in a legal drama about your life?
Well, I sort of like Robert Redford in his younger days. Paul Newman would have been great.
Paul Newman?
Yeah.
All right. That sounds lovely. Let's imagine a world where you wake up tomorrow and everybody just decided to be nice to each other and all the crime has vanished. What do you do with your career in life?
Well, fortunately, I'm not tied to retributive justice. Now, there is a view of retributive justice that I don't accept, which would say, gee, that's too bad because now you can't have any justice and retribution. That would be a crazy view that you need bad people so you can have this kind of justice.
Yeah.
Retributive justice is second best justice. Better that you don't need it than that you have to use it. So that would be a great world. There's lots of intellectual projects. But, for example, I just wrote a history of World War I. I could use some more of that.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. You just don't stop. You are a very motivated person. And also on top of everything you do, you always put events together like the symposium, the First Amendment Symposium, free speech on campuses, which I attended. Chocolate or vanilla ice cream?
Chocolate or vanilla. I hate to be a middle road guy. Vanilla with chocolate sauce.
Vanilla with chocolate sauce.
I order that all the time.
We talked about alcohol a little bit before. What is your favorite alcoholic beverage?
Oh, a really good wine is nice, but Scotch is right up there.
Do you have any final advice for young students, young attorneys about the legal career or life in general?
Yeah, a couple things. One, career-wise, be open to the new things that come your way. You get comfortable doing something you're good at doing, and it's tempting to keep doing it forever. But when you see something new and different that's challenging, remember at the end of your life, you want to look back and say, I took those risks. I did those challenging things. So you want to keep open to those possibilities. And in practicing law, like one of my study partners, maybe you could put together the Navy Pier in Chicago, is what you got to do. You get all sorts of things that are way off what you thought you were going to be doing. The other one is how you relate to people, which is an old philosopher who taught me ethics, who I really greatly admired, Philip Foot at Oxford, used to tell us as students, everybody's life is intrinsically interesting. You could see it in the way they lead it. From their point of view, from the inside, it's intrinsically interesting. The only way it doesn't look interesting to other people is they armor themselves and they don't let you see their life the way they see it. You do want to be open to others enough that you don't become this armored person who's boring and therefore doesn't relate in any intimate or deep way. So there's my advice.
I love it. Professor Moore, it was my true honor to host you on the show today. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.